As I understand it, my job is to try and sort of things in common. Orsalia spoke explicitly about the commons. You spoke specifically about things in common. And I wondered if we could if you would highlight what your take on commonality was, and perhaps starting with Orsalia, just to sort of run over your moments where you were describing the commons as opposed to public space, or perhaps it's a new way of thinking about the res publica.
Well, in this specific example, it has to do like how state, which is the only voting for the state, which is the only political availability there is nowadays in Athens, and how this, not only in Athens, like in any other democratic country. So this opens up for an arena of political participation that it's more direct. It has to do more, like if public space, it's actually when you exercise your civic rights. This I would open it like a common arena that it's available for everybody, like to come and exercise their civic rights, and which is something that we forgot that constituted from the beginning, like it's in the beginning of the definition of ancient polis, like this term of agora and participation in the political has to do with polis. I mean, they're bound together in this the common aspect of the politic, which is forgotten. That's why I think it's essential, like these open platforms, I mean, they have their own problems, and sometimes I think they can even cease to be commons, but they open up for this political participation, which I think it's the more, like significant aspect of the common.
So it's distinctly to do with participating in something that is understood to be shared.
And setting your own rules as well, because it has to do with, like self-management as well. It has to do with, basically I think the most significant characteristic is the horizontal distribution of power, which it's different from any other form, whether it's a state or there is an organization or an NGO, because for this moment, you are one of the pieces that constitute, like this network, and the power is distributed horizontally, like it was in the Agora, like you had to vote, everybody has to vote and exercise this right. And now the state is such a hierarchical structure, and like the same thing goes for the architect as a designer, for example, in this hierarchical structure and the predefined meaning. But I think the commons calls for an horizontality, to disperse this power and to disperse this meaning in horizontal, like try to find a new way of distributing this thing, or the meaning or the power.
Well, perhaps that is then the moment to say, because you didn't specifically use the word common. But
no, but I think it's very crucial. In my context, let's say, in my mind, I think there are two things that are common. First of all, space. I mean, architectural space is common. We have to rethink a lot about the usual authority we have in our minds where space is designed. It's not exactly like that. And when it's designed in this way, it's very interesting to see how composition itself changes. While there's not one form, there are things there that you organize. There is not a hierarchy, not even in space. There's not in shape. I'm sorry. There is nothing like that. Wholeness is a different thing. It's just a part of the thing. Part and wholeness are just parts. The one helps us to navigate, the rest to live. And the second thing is what I like. I'm very interested in your distance with meaning, and I really agree. Although I've been working a lot with these cross-modal translations, cross-media translations. I mean, I saw it a little bit like poetry, music, and things. I think we have a lot of things in common. If you think about it, I mean, there are ways of thinking. Everything is the way of thinking. So in that sense, the common approach to see the borders between media, to see the borders between people, between private space and public space, is the issue, because it helps us also to define what is each one of them and what they have in common. So by relating things, you realize both things, what they are and what they have in common. And this is very important. And in terms of meaning, I think that in architecture, meaning is constructed with very simple things. It's a very banal, everyday thing, but it's really meaningful. So I'm not saying in a very romantic way or anything, it's true. So that's it.
And what struck me in your discussion of Mallarmé's poem, which I really appreciated, I really enjoyed, actually the way, well perhaps I should backtrack a bit, the way I've understood that poem before is that it's a kind of study of what's possible if much of what is held in common has been abandoned. And so if, and I think one of your definitions of the commons talked about it as being a social infrastructure of cultural institutions and rules and traditions, if all of that has become a blank page, has become abstract space, or what you called a flat horizontal surface, there's a real tenuousness of meaning. And what you didn't, I mean, what I particularly enjoyed was your bringing us into that notion of peripheral vision, that we make these very contingent,
Less conscious and
moments of connection, and also the way you pointed out the comme si, the as if, this is as if this, as if that. And I'm afraid I didn't go back to read the poem, but as far as I remember, one could say it's about a shipwreck.
Yes.
And it's about is this flotsam and jetsam just floating on the waves? Does it come together into anything? Is it just floating on the blank page? Does it just float? Or is it as if this, as if that? And it struck me that what he is doing with those, with the words scattered across the page, this roll of the dice, is that the words, and here I'm borrowing from Tafuri, they're like, they become these signs in their pure objecthood, or they could do. And so it's, I think, more close to your notion, or it's potentially more close to your notion of something that's common, where something that's common is kind of at its most generic, at its least invested. And so I wondered if you might elaborate on your take on the common, so we can see whether there's anything in common between the takes.
No, I think the concept of the common can be conceptualized on different levels. And of course, it can be seen as a form of property and a form of using together some resources that are in common, and especially, I don't know, some resources that are central to the reproduction of human life, especially, I don't know, the air, water, or and in this sense, this idea is really connected to the concept of enclosure or primitive accumulation. So, in a way, the continuous siege of capital or capitalistic apparatus in capturing these resources. But I think there are also other resources, maybe that are constituent of human beings in their collectivity, for example, our body or our mind, or the collective soul and the collective body, as I call them, and that are also in a way object of some sort of primitive accumulation, of capture from capitalistic apparatuses, especially in the contemporary forms of capitalistic or post-Fordist capitalism. Because, of course, the production is not based anymore on the production of material objects, or maybe there is no more primacy in the production of material object, but the primacy is in the production of immaterial products. That and in the production of this immaterial product, we have a centrality of these common generic traits of human being, and this is for this reason that I'm interested in post-operaist critique, because they are able in a way to have a particular take on communism, which is not based on more on the communist ideology, if you like, or the communist projection of a future socialist society, or a communist representation of our life, but they are trying to locate the communist project in the very common aspects of human nature and being together.
And the way I was reading that, and I clearly shouldn't have used the word Marxist, but anyway, I was thinking of Hannah Arendt's critique of thinking about life in terms of what she calls mere life processes, mere generative processes. And so in a way, by reducing things to the generic, it is well, she would call it reductive, reducing them to those generative processes, which she would see as something that would stop the common from being constantly reaffirmed, constantly established. And so I think this in a way was the last of my questions, because I realise I'm hogging all the questions here, but it was to do with it was both to Amir and to Orsalia, where I was wondering what to you is the relationship between production and creativity or invention. And in your case it was, what's the link between commons and production? That you seem to be slightly uneasy about whether this was to do with productivity or not. And so this is really me just being very intrigued by this, as I saw it, seeing creativity to lie in raw productivity. I don't know which of you wants to address that. She's saying you.
No, I think creativity and productivity nowadays can be seen on the same plane, on the same level. As we know, Arendt divided human existence, human activities in action and labor. But for example, authors such as Paolo Virno pointed out that actually this distinction between labor, action, and creativity is not anymore in the reality of production of today, because all of these levels in a way are intertwined, and it's not possible anymore to determine what is production, what is creation,
so
and what
action in
is
itself
action.
is a form of
because labor becomes more and more progressively similar to political action, and labor can be made only with other people. Labor is not anymore performed silently with a machine, but is performed with other people. So I think there is no more distinction between all these levels.
I should say, actually, I thought your paper was a brilliant assessment of our symptoms, that just what you bring out of that fudging of the distinction between productivity and creativity, I think is, well, you do it very, very clearly. And is that kind of where you were in the commonality?
Essentially, yes, because what is happening nowadays is that creativity, with some parts, it's like it doesn't depend on one person or one machine. You know, like it's trying. There is the market that tries to grasp of this creativity and productivity and put a label in this, which I think what the three papers do, they emphasize. I mean, how the notion of commons is something that is very obvious. It's there, and since it's long forgotten, and somehow, you know, like the state or the capital try to grasp this notion and commercialize it and take advantage of it. For example, creativity nowadays, you have patents of songs, for example, and you cannot use this music score because somebody, you know, like though it might stem from a traditional song, somebody puts a patent, or yoga, let's say, techniques, for example, that they're from ancient India, and somebody says, okay, I take this common creativity and what is granted, and I make it this type of yoga, and since then you're not allowed to teach this without paying me some money. So I think all these three, they take or the language or the meaning or what is private, or what is public, you know, like all these notions that they're there already, but I think they're quite crucial if we deal with this notion nowadays, because it emphasizes what is already there and what is forgotten. And somehow, you know, like if we are not alert in this notion, you know, like this will go either to private or to completely public, which is not right, you know, like because these are common assets. And I think that's the common thing of this paper, that we need to redefine the meaning and open it again, you know, like this structured meaning and the hierarchy and what it's not common anymore, you know, like it tries to concretize, to spread it and give it a new meaning.
And not a permanent meaning. Right?
Yeah.
I have hope things enough.
Does anyone would like to ask a question?
When
No, it's open. It's okay. You can use it.
only to offer my congratulations to all three presentations, and if I make any kind of comments that may appear to be in any way critical, it's only to propose ways of where that might help a bit. I start from Amir's because it's the one of the presentation. Well, first of all, I have to say that it's very difficult for me to kind of suddenly plunge and kind of adapt into something that has been on the minds of the presenters for some time now, and on which they have been working and elaborating into kind of a fair degree of complexity. And I may have, and I think I did, and in some way it's probably their fault as well, misunderstand, probably, or been unable to fully understand, but only to get a glimpse of intentions, and that is what perhaps I would like to comment on. So I start with Amir's because I'm a bit more familiar with his thesis, because I've heard it, I've heard presentations of it before, and it's clear to me also from the last point that was made about on the distinction of Hannah Arendt's, you know, kind of categories of labor, work, and action, that latent in Amir's thesis is this idea that the conditions of labor and work are kind of merging. You know, I mean, that kind of, it's not. Though what still remains a question. I mean, one of the important precepts of Hannah Arendt is the idea that whereas labor is what is embodied within our biological cycle, and therefore dies with us when we die, work is something that maybe we have produced that kind of transcends our death and remains kind of on the public sphere. And I think that is still a valid point, you know, that there are things that we do within this kind of new condition that nevertheless live longer than us. But I think that the point that was clear to me was that, and I don't know if it's the same for the other two presentations, that it was clear to me that Amir presented only a part of what his whole thesis is about. You know, because, I mean, for instance, it's clear he mentioned, you mentioned kind of a post-Fordist capitalism, and you mentioned Virno, but I mean, then you went on to the part of your work that deals with Piranesi, Noli, and Peter Eisenman and his kind of influence from Derrida and the decomposition, etc., without really spending any time defining more the idea of the multitude vis-a-vis the idea of the common, kind of, which would have helped, if you like, this presentation, which leads me to a more general comment in that I believe that perhaps one should, at this point, stress the importance of the idea of the summary. When we work in very complex pieces of work that kind of contain many chapters, many precepts, etc., it is good from time to time to be able to make a summary of the whole thing, both for the purposes of communication and also for one's own ability to control the whole. And I think that to know how to summarize large, complex and multi-layered texts that somehow can act as a definition of the thesis as a whole would be very good. And this is where I thought was slightly a weakness of the presentations, that they kind of the intentions are often left, at least for me or for an outsider, and I speak as an outsider, they're kind of left to be read between the lines. They're not kind of articulated in a clear, in a sufficiently communicable way. So to go on to Iris Lycourioti's presentation, I mean, I found the kind of I may have misunderstood many of the things you said, but I mean, what I do find really challenging and of great potential, this kind of idea of a reconsideration of kind of hierarchies as we know them, and in particular, if I understand you correctly, with regards to the idea of composition, right? And I think that it's a for me, this idea of composition, whether it is architecture or music, etc., is something that has been left for too many decades on the sidelines, and it's really worth kind of re-exploring it. This idea of kind of breaking linear sequences and chance operations, and then redefining, having arrived at a kind of a certain level of indeterminacy, then try to recompose, if you like. But I wasn't quite clear, though nevertheless, I mean, I think that you need, at least, maybe if one reads all your thesis, it becomes explicit, but on a presentation like this, it's much more difficult to follow and to kind of really be convinced that one has understood everything. I mean, it's interesting the parallel with the kind of analysis of John Cage in the sense of in the field of music, and it's really also very interesting to see architecture and music being put together as separate entities, but nevertheless comparable. Though, I mean, personally, I don't think that John Cage's reconsideration of music has really led us anywhere new in terms of our understanding or re-appreciating music itself. So, and when you present your the most challenging of your claims, you kind of quickly abandon them, or you don't spend enough time clarifying them, perhaps because they still need more substantiation, or perhaps because there was no time. But I mean, it was noticeable that the more challenging your claims were, the more they were kind of tentatively stated. I mean, I may be wrong. I mean, I told you, I found it difficult, but nevertheless really really challenging. And I suppose it's making and I think it's quite an important one, making the transition from something that is a very long text, where, for instance, Mallarmé's poem is there in front of our eyes, analyzed, etc., to something that kind of mentions it in a very short, in a very short presentation. And I think that it's very useful, going back to this idea of the summary, it's very useful to exercise oneself into really making kind of summaries that are both communicable and both, but while at the same time are conveying the essence of the thesis without betraying it. I mean, this idea of kind of density as a kind of a new built-in glue of the parts that perhaps 20 minutes is not enough. I mean, that is, but it's an exercise worth doing. Well, with on Orsalia's Dimitriou's project. Well, I suppose you are aware that this week there have been kind of even more dramatic events happening in Greece that illustrate what you are saying, even more so, as well as the kind of ideological confrontation that is going on at the moment. But what is interesting in terms of the thesis is this idea of public space, that it only becomes within the political domain, and when there is a political demonstration. In every other sense, it is clear that that in our present society, in our present political system, they have brought about the demise of the public and the public space. There is no public, you know. There is no public, therefore there is no public space. And that's when we go to the kind of idea, to Virno and to the idea of substituting the word public with the word multitude, and with the word common, you know, which is what we share, because that's all we've got left. Nevertheless, in situations where the space of a city is used within or for the purposes of a political demonstrations, I mean, when they're used to make a statement of resistance, I think that then you do have this older concept of public space coming alive again. I mean, and I think that this is, on the one hand, a very interesting, but at the same time very sad state of affairs in terms of our present moment in civilization. I mean, things, and there we are led more and more into a kind of a private present where everything, for instance, you mentioned the question of copyright and patent, things that are kind of extremely unethical, that should be outlawed, but nevertheless we live within a world of copyright, and where everything is a copyright and everything is a patent, and you risk libel or you risk going to court by mentioning things that are common. So, and also what is sad is that the Navarino Park is a very, very small manifestation of public instrumentality. I mean, it's nothing compared to what it should be. You know, it's a small, pathetic resistance of a small group from the public, you know. That's all the notes that maybe I forgot something, but that's all I can, all the points I can make at this stage.
Hi, congratulations for your presentations. I just wanted to ask Orsalia a question. From your presentation, I kind of understood a binary opposition between what is state, bad, police and private, and what is public and good. And I have in mind other examples where the state was the agent that tried to preserve something public and common, and individualism in Greece was so strong that the public became very vulnerable, starting from the forest areas surrounding Athens that were appropriated by villas, and even going on to the recent effort by the Minister of Environment, Birbili, to protect the N.T.U.A areas, and then the many...
She abandoned it.
Yeah, she abandoned it because so many deputies reacted and, acting with a clientelist approach, tried to protect their interests back in their hometowns. So to me, I mean, I feel that it's much more complicated to treat the state as the bad side that does not provide or does not try to protect public space. So one question is this, and the other is, I'd like to question that horizontality that you talk about in the function of Parco Navarino, because having studied in the area as well, having studied in Exarchia, I feel that there are many flows and camps within the public, and they are not one body, and there are conflicts between the anarchist groups and the inhabitants, and I'm sure there is a hierarchy within the anarchist groups. I'm sure there is. So I'd like for you to share with us your experience in that, because I'm sure you know much more than me.
First of all, regarding the first question, it's not that the state is bad. It's that the state, as it is now, it doesn't represent social constituency. That's the problem. And what happens, like with the regulating also the other spaces, like the parks that they're around, not only in the city of Athens, but it's just where in Athens the phenomena are more intense. The problem is that all this should be somehow resolved with common logic. And it's not that the state is the bad one or the private is the good one. It has to be a way that the citizens or the common logic, there should be a biggest influence in these decisions that they're taking for the natural environment or public spaces, that they influence everybody. So, I mean, in a way, it's not that the state is bad. In some cases, for example, as you said, it's the good thing. And this is, for example, saying that self-management is the solution to everything. It's not, because commons, as you said before, of course there are a lot of hierarchies. It's very difficult to solve everything in horizontal level. And this actually is the challenge of commons. How will you manage to, because you have successful cases and unsuccessful cases. For example, as the state as necessary, for example, is in another case that you have, citizens trying to take the condition in their own hands, which is in Agios Panteleimonas, where you have exactly the same pattern, which are citizens that they are against immigrants. So they say the state is not working, we take the control here and we start beating and chasing the immigrant, which is the same. I don't think that you don't need the state as a regulatory mechanism. I think it's, in my point of view, it's necessary, but it should be, a different way, the state should be controlled by the citizens as well, it should not be in the top of pyramid and be alone and untouched, it should be better, in a better way, so that the citizens, except from voting, they should, have a claim and a saying on what they're doing or what the state is doing. It should be bi-directional, because at the moment it is the state and it's on the top and it's forcing the politics down. And it should be actually what is the part of democracy is that you have the citizens who constitute the state. And so it has to go on the other direction as well. Somebody has to control what are these actions that they're taking. And in the other one, with horizontality, this is really, really a big challenge, what happens there. And it needs, we have to be very careful about this. And what you have said about, that it's a pathetic form of action, it's not by itself, because now...
No, of course.
No, I mean,
I wish it could be more.
Yeah, but it's a network nowadays, you have this network
Very small network.
it starts expanding, because it's after December we had solidarities, they were 20 or 30 solidarities, and now if you see the map of the Observatory of Open Spaces, we have now like 80 solidarities claiming the space all around. Then they start to organize, because for me that's where the good thing is, it's in the network, because the bigger the network becomes, then nobody stands alone. You know, like you have somebody observing and challenging what are the actions of the state. And this goes to any other areas like Itsparnitha, you know, like they try to build a casino, what happens in the Lycourioti. So when you have this network coming more denser, they can press, instead of pressing only for a small park or why did you rip the tree out, they can press for bigger political actions.
No,
you know,
I completely agree with you. And
yeah.
when I say pathetic, I mean it that
I agree.
I mean more a kind of a reflection on its powerlessness.
Yes.
And its powerlessness, which is the issue, brings to your second point, which is a kind of a two-way operation of democracy, which of course needs constitutional change, but to make it two-way. But that would be the solution. Because as long as that solution doesn't exist, any form of resistance, in the end, ultimately is powerless.
Yeah.
How does...
All it can call for is new elections. I mean, that's not good enough.
No, I think a way to make it denser and denser, you know, like if this nucleus of resistance, they don't stay isolated, but they form a network, then we perhaps stand a chance, because I can see a change of mentality as well, that people, you know, like after December and onwards, people decided like, okay, perhaps it's not only, because I read somewhere that the way Greeks treat the state, it's like a vulture with teeth. That on one hand it's trying to grab what is theirs, you know, like and tax them. On the other hand, they wait for this from the state to nurture them and to offer everything, including the public space. So if we start, you know, like making smaller resistance, we can not say it's small, therefore it's powerless. You know, like if it connects with other things, then it can ask for real change, as it's happening all over the Mediterranean.
Yeah, but also this change of mentality has also a negative side to it, which is that it is also turning against immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other. I mean, I'm asking this question, you know, when I'm doing the research, I'm asking very frequently, like, if you're how would say, expelling junkies from the public space, and we consider this as a good thing, or for example, priests, or for example, people that they have more classic way of dressing, you know, like these people, they cannot circulate in these areas. They say, isn't this, you know, like you don't expel them from public space exactly as the right wing is doing in other areas, and they say, no, it's completely different. You know, like one is inclusive, the other one is exclusive. But for me, this is very dangerous. You know, like when do you take the law in your own hands? You know, like we'll turn into Wild West in Athens. You know, like all the citizens doing whatever they want to do.
I think that's what I wanted to ask, was how you talked about the assembly in the park. Who are they? How did they constitute themselves?
It's everyone. That's the difference. Because in Agios Panteleimonas, you know, like the assembly, it's made, they call it, you know, like the enraged citizens, and it's basically constituted by Greek nationals born and bred, you know, like in Athens, you know, like nobody else can enter. They even, you know, like sometimes they have a conflict, they say, oh, why do you come in the assembly? You live in another area, you know, because you have people, you know, like defending immigrants, Greek ones, and they say, okay, let's go to this assembly to see, you know, like, I mean, we cannot allow them to beat everybody up. And lately, you know, as you know, there are pogroms against immigrants in this area. And the difference with the other assemblies, you know, like with Open Park, is that they are inclusive. Everyone can participate. You know, like whatever issue you have, you can go there and negotiate it. Without saying that it doesn't include exclusions, obviously.
Would you like to include? Sorry.
I'm not sure if I need this.
It's on.
Okay. It was just really one comment I was thinking. It's quite interesting, isn't it? When I was thinking, what is a kind of PhD? It's like a rite of passage. One is always thinking about the things that interest you, and you're working within a system which is encouraging you to think about that a particular way. And it was particularly resonating for me when I was thinking about your paper, Orsalia. Both in terms of the visuals that you presented and the difference between when you read the paper and when you conversed about it. And in terms of the visual, for instance, I looked at those images in the PowerPoint and I thought, for such a kind of passionate, empowered discourse in which you're sitting, it would strike me that there's a possibility in the methodology for you to change and embrace that, to not think about the conventions that you would normally work in, but to consider if there was a visual way in which you could exploit that action. And in terms of the textual, when you read the paper, you know, it is that thing where people are thinking that what you're saying is clearly constructed, but it is the question of when architects talk to other architects, sometimes we make conversations that only we understand. And when you conversed about it and debated it, there was a kind of different sort of passion to the argument. And I wondered if there were possibilities in the way you might work with your particular thesis topic to exploit those things so that you could really get to a kind of deeper level with the topic. So it's more of a kind of comment, I'm sorry, I should have prefaced it with that. And yes.
You mean theoretically?
Well, I think the way in which we talk, and I always get this confused in architecture, because when we write and when we talk, we do different things. And when you have particular topics, the possibility to say things differently, I think, is kind of an opportunity. And I'm just bringing it up as a potential more than anything.
I think that's very interesting. My research is by video. So actually, you know, like half it's written and half it will be a video relation, which employs a completely different language. And what I think it's the difference, like when we write, we assume somehow, you know, like in the PhD, that there is some sort of objectivity. You know, like we write and we base what we write in things that are already proven. You know, like we cannot start saying, you know, like whatever, you know, that's the concept of the PhD at least, that you have to prove something, you have to stand on a thesis based on things that are already somehow discussed. It's not tabula rasa, you don't start writing a PhD from the beginning. But when you work with visual media and you go in the research area, and especially this issue, you know, what happens with the public spaces, that it's brand new, then it's very strange, because then you realize that actually there is not such a thing as objectivity. You know, like, because when you're standing, you know, like when you set the camera, what kind of visual material you're employing, then you understand that there is actually an empathy on your subject, and you can never claim, I mean, even if there is not such a thing as objective footage, for example, even anthropologists, you know, like when you set the camera and they start recording, you know, like people, they are aware that something is recording, it's altering the perception in front of it. So, but I find very interesting, and I think it's, especially in architecture, it's interesting to see how we can employ other type of language, you know, like in visual media, you know, like to say things and to perhaps transmit a meaning that it opens more, not only to the strictly academic, you know, like audience, but to other type of audience. Like try somehow, now that we talk about the commons and the hierarchy of meaning, you know, like maybe if we try to dissolve this and spread it to a wider audience, it would, I think everybody would benefit from this. You know, like to employ different language somehow.
I mean, just if you're already making video, then it would have been lovely to have had that here. But, you know, the difficulty that you're talking about of objectivity in a PhD, I think there's a really interesting questions. And they should be sort of embraced rather than seen as a negativity, so that the method can be used in another way to exploit what you want to do. I very much enjoyed all three, so thank you very much.